Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu filling in for Riz Khan. This week marks the 5th year anniversary of the war in Iraq. Over $800 billion in US tax dollars have been spent. An estimated 2.5 million Iraqis have been displaced. Almost 4,000 US soldiers have been killed. And there is a civilian death toll that ranges from more than 100,000 to 1 million. In Iraq, the run-up to this anniversary has been marked with continued violence. US Vice President Dick Cheney made a surprise visit to the country and called the war a, quote, successful endeavor. He also promised Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki the unwavering support of the United States. When US President George Bush warned in a 2003 speech that this conflict could be longer and more difficult than some predict, perhaps no one realized how long the US involvement in Iraq would be. Joining me right here in the studio is Jonathan Steele, who's covered the Iraq war since the beginning as a senior correspondent for the British national newspaper, The Guardian. His latest book is called Defeat: Why America and Britain Lost Iraq. Jonathan, welcome to the show. I want to start right at the outset of your book there, and this is in reference to Iraq. You say that no matter how good the intelligence, no matter how noble the cause, this war was doomed from the very beginning. Why did you believe it was doomed from the beginning?
Well, what I'm saying is the occupation was doomed from the beginning. Obviously, the invasion was successful in its own terms. In 3 weeks, they toppled Saddam. But what went wrong was the decision to carry on in Iraq, even when they'd accomplished their mission, and keep it open-ended, give Iraqis no idea how long it was going to go on for. I mean, nobody likes to have their country occupied. They don't want to see foreign tanks and foreign troops on their streets. So unless you tell them when you're leaving, you're soon going to run into suspicion, resentment, and ultimately opposition and even resistance, armed resistance, which is exactly what happened.
And of course, Iraq also has a history of being invaded by countries from the West, and this would have not played well with the Iraqi people at that time as well.
Exactly. I mean, the Bush people and Tony Blair and Britain somehow thought that by toppling Saddam, which was indeed a popular thing, people didn't like Saddam, the majority of Iraqis, they would get a blank check to do whatever they liked in Iraq on an open-ended basis. And of course, people don't like that. Particularly, these are the two countries, the United States and Britain, that have a long history, century-long history of intervention in the Middle East. The British in the first half of the last century, they indeed occupied Iraq itself and imposed a Sunni monarchy on that country, and they met resistance and put it down quite brutally. Then the Americans in the second half of the 20th century constantly intervening in different parts of the Middle East. So the British and the Americans were coming into to a region and to a culture and to a people who would be naturally very suspicious that this was yet another colonial occupation.
So if you look at it now after 5 years, this is the 5th anniversary of that invasion, how do you see the situation in Iraq now? Do you see it as totally an unmitigated disaster?
Pretty much, yes. I mean, if Vice President Cheney calls this a successful endeavor, I'd like to know from him what he would define as failure. As you pointed out, perhaps 1 million civilians have been killed, 4,000 US troops have died, trillions of dollars of money have been spent, the country's still in chaos, very, very unstable. I mean, it seems to me that this is a disaster.
Yet there are some. There was something published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Anthony Cordesman there, saying that there is a possibility now, after this surge with the decrease in the level of violence, there is a possibility that stability and security could come to Iraq.
Well, there's always a possibility, and one hopes that that might happen, but I think it'll happen it's much more likely to happen once the US leaves. Once there's a date given for a fairly early withdrawal of US troops, that will change the whole political equation and make it much easier for Iraqis to come together when they know that they will be running their own country. It'll also make it much easier for the Iraqis to stand up to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's mounted the second invasion of Iraq since 2003. The first set of foreigners were the British and the Americans. The second were these jihadi militants from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and other parts of the Muslim world. And the Iraqi Sunnis, now in this al-Sahwa awakening movement, have stood up against Al-Qaeda and said, get out. Now, once the Americans leave, then any possible rationale for Al-Qaeda to be there falls completely away. If the Americans are going, and that's why the Al-Qaeda people came in, then it's time for the Al-Qaeda people to go. So that will make it much easier for the Iraqis themselves to work out their own political future.
Yet the other side of that argument, and the one that is put by people who advocate that the Americans do stay in Iraq, is that Al-Qaeda will flourish and in fact will have a base in the Middle East from which to launch operations regionally and even operations in other parts of the world. and that there could also be a free-for-all in Iraq between the Sunnis and the Shias. The civil war that's been simmering will break out into very open civil war. It could be a lot worse.
Well, let me deal with the first thing about al-Qaeda. I mean, if that argument is used by people who supported the war and supported President Bush, then it's a rather late argument to use, because there was no al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003. It's this invasion, this occupation that's attracted al-Qaeda in there. And so now to say we have to stay there in order to get rid of al-Qaeda is really turning the whole thing upside down. It's Alice in Wonderland. Secondly, the other point you make about the Sunni Shia sectarian issues and could it collapse into civil war, I tend to be hopeful that it won't. This is a relatively modern phenomenon in Iraqi history, this clashing between the Sunnis and the Shias, even though it's reached terrible proportions and an extraordinary amount of people have been killed, and there's obviously a desire for revenge there and bitterness and so on. It is relatively new. The Sunni Shia thing is not endemic in Iraqi society. It's relatively new. It's only in the last 4 years that it's come out at this level, and so therefore it's like a cancer, and it's been detected now in time. So as long as the US withdraws and the Iraqis can get back to running their own country, I think this cancer can be eradicated and cut out, and the body politic of Iraq can survive. Obviously, if it goes on longer, the chances of survival get less, but that's another reason why we want an early withdrawal of the US troops.
But is there a danger that because there's been such a high level of violence between these two groups, that there could be score settling after the United States has left? Not just that, but the country could be effectively divided. It could be balkanized into Sunni areas, Shia areas, Kurdish areas.
Well, there could be Sunni score settling and Shia score settling. There already is already. But as I say, this problem was provoked by al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda is now a bit on the back foot, on the defensive, and hopefully will be driven out of the country. And that means that the provocation for this violence will be removed. As you say, and as I perfectly well agree, there's a lot of bitterness now, and a lot of people have lost family members, and they want revenge of some kind, because obviously when you have no real police force and no proper law and order, people take justice into their own hands, unfortunately. But I think it can be contained, and there's no need for it to collapse into civil war, and I certainly don't think it's going to collapse into fragmentation and partition of Iraq. Most Iraqis don't want that. Sunnis certainly don't want that. Why would they want to be some little rump Sunnistan in the western part of Iraq? It would be landlocked, it would have no oil, it would have very little arable land except along the Euphrates River. It's nothing that any Sunni would want. Among the Shias, there's huge debate over this issue, and I think those who want massive autonomy for the Shia areas and possibly a breakaway are of a tiny minority. The Sadrists, Muqtada al-Sadar's people, after all, they are nationalists, they want a unified Iraq, they're not talking about partition, and they're very strong. So I think the forces that want unity of Iraq and are against fragmentation are much, much stronger than the ones who are pushing for it.
Do you believe at the outset of the invasion, or just before, that there was support generally among Iraqis for the American government's intention to topple Saddam Hussein?
Well, I spent quite a bit of time in Amman before the invasion, waiting to go in, because I didn't have a visa to get in, and it was impossible to cross there. And I used the time as productively as I could to talk to Iraqis. There was a community of something like 300,000 Iraqi exiles already in Jordan at that stage. And it was much easier to talk to them than it was for my colleagues who were in Baghdad to talk to Iraqis in Baghdad, because then journalists had to have a minder with them, and obviously anybody they spoke to would be suspicious and wouldn't necessarily give their true opinion. In Amman there was none of that. So I talked to a wide range of people, and I found people very torn in their minds about, do we want this invasion or not? And this kind of confusion and this terrible dilemma that they faced, people who wanted to get rid of Saddam, was encapsulated by one man I spoke to who was a butcher, a Sunni, who'd left Iraq about 5 years before, 1998, and he said to me, I want this war to happen, I don't want this war to happen. I want Saddam to be toppled, I don't want my country to be invaded. You know, they were completely split. But when I eventually got into Baghdad in those early days of April, and talked to Iraqis, and other colleagues of mine did the same thing, we found already that even in those very first hours, more people thought of it as an occupation than as a liberation, and that was borne out by the opinion polls.
Even at the initial stages?
Even at the initial stages, well. And there was an opinion poll that was done actually in October 2003, but it asked people, what did you think back in April, and what do you think now? And 48% said back in April we already saw it as an occupation, and only 38% said it was a liberation. By October 2003, 6 months after the Americans had arrived, it was up to 66% who saw it as an occupation, and those who thought it was a liberation, it dropped dramatically to 15%.
And personally, I mean, you actually became a victim of the war in some respects, because you had several assignments in Iraq for the Guardian newspaper, and on one occasion you were actually kidnapped.
Yes, I've been there 8 times since the invasion. I spent about a month each time. On one occasion I was kidnapped, actually, as you say, in Najaf in July 2004. We were in a car. I had a driver, Iraqi translator. I was sitting in the back. Suddenly a man in a dish dasher stepped out in front of the car, pulled a pistol from his pocket, and forced the driver to get out, and the translator, and then 2 other armed men also appeared. And the driver and the translator were put in the back of the car with me. One of the armed men got in with us. The other 2, one drove and the other sat in the passenger seat. And we were driven out of town. And I thought, well, this is it. You know, this is the moment that everybody, both Iraqi and foreigner, because of course Iraqis are kidnapped more often than foreigners. It's the moment you dread. You know, what do you do next? And what do they mean? Who are these people? Are they going to kill you? Do they want a ransom? And we drove out of town a little way, and then this hijacker, the driver, turned around and drove us back into town. And for some reason I felt a sort of moment of relief. I had this sort of image, maybe a cliche, that, you know, if you're going to be held in a safe house somewhere, it's going to be in the country, a sort of lonely farmhouse somewhere in a grove of palm trees or something. If we're driving back into town, it must be something, you know, a bit less menacing. And we got right into Najaf, near the shrine of Imam Ali, and there was a checkpoint run by the Muqtada al-Sadr people, and the hijack driver actually produced some sort of ID and showed it to the checkpoint people. And I thought, oh, they must be somehow related to the Sadrists. And again, I was a bit relieved, because I know the Sadr people are well organized and to some extent disciplined. At least they were much more in those days, 2004. And then we were then taken to an office right near the shrine, told to get out of the car. They took our cell phones, and then they started to interrogate us. And it became clear that they thought I was some kind of spy, some kind of British spy, not really a journalist. And luckily, earlier in the day, we'd actually interviewed one of the Sadr spokespeople. And so I said to through the translator, I said, look, can you ask them to try and get in touch with this man? And he will vouch for the fact that I'm a journalist. I came to see him in the morning, showed him my ID and everything else, and I'm okay. And after about 20 minutes of discussion and argument, they did go off and they found this man, and he came back and said, yes, of course, this chap's from The Guardian. He's a journalist. We mustn't behave like this. It's very bad for our image. And he actually kind of reprimanded the hijacker. So the story had a happy ending.
Well, good for you. I mean, that was a very lucky break
It
there.
was indeed.
But, you know, I mean, kidnapping is a very commonplace thing in Iraq, you know, as is violence against ordinary civilians. It brings us to one of the emails that we received earlier on, and this is from Sabah in Eritrea. And the question is, you've been in Iraq many times. What is life like for ordinary Iraqis? It's a big question.
It's a big question. And of course life is terrible compared. There's been nothing in history like this for Iraqis. Even the worst periods of the Saddam regime were not, the kind of insecurity and the violence was not so widespread. It affected that minority of people who stood up to Saddam and were then executed or tortured or whatever. But this is now so widespread. Nobody knows when they go out of their house whether they're going to come home safely, when they send their children to school, when they go to the market, and so on. It has got a little bit better. I recognize that in the last 6 to 9 months it's got a good deal better in Baghdad and so on. People feel much safer, but life is pretty terrible, and your caller, your emailer will know that something like 2 million Iraqis have left the country, mainly for Jordan, Syria, some of the Gulf states. Another 1.5 million are displaced, fled their homes, but are remaining somewhere else inside Iraq. So it's a terrible situation.
You know, there are those, especially here in the Bush administration, and people who support what is going on in Iraq, who will say that what is referred to as the surge, this reinforcements, American reinforcements that were sent to Iraq, has in fact brought the level of violence down, and in fact, as they put it, is working.
It's true that the level of violence has brought been brought down, and that's a tremendous step forward. But it's not just the extra 27,000 US troops that have done that. I think there are three other factors which are actually more important than the extra troops. The first is this Al-Sahwa awakening movement in Anbar province of Iraqi Sunnis standing up to Al-Qaeda and saying, we don't want your activity and we don't want you to go on killing Shia in this appalling way, and these suicide car bombs and attacks on shrines and so on. There's another one just in Kabul this week alone, outside the Imam Hussein shrine. So they're standing up to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's now on the defensive, is less able to attack civilians. That's one reason why it's gone down. Second one is that Muqtada al-Sadr called a ceasefire for 6 months. He's now renewed it for another 6 months, and his people, although
I just want to ask you, what's in it for him?
To have a ceasefire?
Yes.
Well, I think he wants to show he's a responsible politician and to call a halt. And hopefully this will be the model. Hopefully the US will respond with its own ceasefire, and because ultimately there has to be a ceasefire on all sides to enable the US withdrawal to happen, you know, with some kind of dignity, if you like, for the US. Where there's no point in shooting at the Americans if they're moving to the exit. Let them get out peacefully, as quickly as possible. So let's have a ceasefire, everybody, all around. And so I think Muqtada is giving that signal, a very, very useful signal indeed.
And that's brought the level of violence.
That's also brought the level of violence down.
We just have 2 minutes left, and I want to get to something which is looking at the British involvement in the Iraq invasion. And this is from your book. I'm just going to quote here from your book. Tony Blair was set on going to war at Bush's side under any circumstances. MI6, that's the British intelligence gathering organization, and the Joint Intelligence Committee did warn him that invading Iraq would help Al-Qaeda and find new recruits and increase the terrorist threat to Britain, but this was not enough to deter him. And that begs the question, why did he do it? Because it turns out that his decision to march in lockstep with George Bush was political suicide.
Well, there were two reasons. One was he felt strategically Britain has to be with the US when the chips are down, when big issues like war and peace are on the table. So it was a kind of strategic decision. The second one was that he is a moralist, Tony Blair. He sees everything in these very simple black and white terms. And when a whole series of academics went to him in advance of the invasion and said, this is a very complicated thing, don't think you're going to be welcomed, this is a country with full of internal problems and so on. Instead of dealing with that issue, his response to them was, but Saddam is uniquely evil, isn't he? He just wasn't interested in the political context or the history of colonialism or anything. He just saw it in black and white moral terms.
Jonathan Steele, we're going to have to leave it there. Congratulations on the publication of your book, and the book is Defeat: Why America and Britain Lost Iraq. And thank you for being with us. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. See you next time. Street Talk is next.